Welcome back. In the midst of this European debt crisis we're all talking about, the former head of IBM is raising alarms about our runaway debt here in the United States. Earlier today, the legendary former IBM CEO Lou Gerstner telling CNBC Squawk Box that the U.S. cannot keep doing what it's doing without heading for disaster.
Why is it that people can wake up every day in Washington today and say, gee, this is great what we're doing here. We're on a great program here. We're going to crash in December. We're going to have sequestration. We're going to have the taxes roll off. We're going to have the payroll tax holiday roll off. We're going to have all these things are going to happen. And what are we doing about it? We have 46 million Americans on food stamps. That's 1 out of 6 Americans. I mean, how can these people ever leave Washington without fixing these problems?
Well, he saved IBM, so should we listen to him to save America? Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute sure thinks so. Stan Colliner of Corvus Communications says IBM and America are two totally different beasts. Dan, you agree with Gerstner. Let's talk about why. Why do you think we're seeing a disconnect between Washington and what's really happening with the debt problems?
There's a disconnect because people in Washington don't think past the next election, and there are two crises. He's talking about the one in December. Well, they're not going to focus on that in Washington until after the election in November. So there's lots of posturing, lots of finger pointing, but politicians have spent America into a ditch. We do have a short-term crisis at the end of the year, but that's nothing compared to our long-term Greek-style fiscal crisis because of entitlements, and politicians aren't dealing with that either.
Why? I mean, we've been talking about this so much, about the tax cuts and the spending programs going away at year end. Why aren't we hearing leadership on this? At least the conversation happening.
Because politicians get elected and reelected by spending other people's money, and they will keep that game going until, as Margaret Thatcher famously said, you run out of other people's money.
And Stan, you don't think what's happening in Europe could actually happen in the United States, right? Why not?
Well, first of all, there are some tremendous differences between the United States and Europe. In particular, we have our own currency, and each individual country does not. At least those are under the euro. And there doesn't seem to be a lack of appetite for U.S. debt. Dan's right. Over the long term, this is going to be a problem. The question here, Dan, is, first of all, is it just spending? Because we've also had tax cuts when we couldn't afford them and haven't paid for them. Second, if you looked at any of the polls, even the most recent ones coming out this week, the politicians are undecided about what to do because there's such a division within the American voter group. Half the Americans want every single big spending program increased, not decreased.
Yeah.
So
what do you do then?
Go ahead, Dan.
But part of the problem is that half of Americans don't pay a federal income tax, so I'm not surprised by that type of data. But on the tax issue, I think that's a key thing to discuss. The long-run numbers from CBO show that federal revenues, even with all the tax cuts extended, will rise above their long-run average. So in the short run, yes, revenues are down because of the economic weakness. In the long run, 100% plus of our problem is because federal spending is growing. And I think we both agree that in the long run, that's really the big challenge.
Except where we disagree, though, Dan, is that federal spending is growing because of decisions that were made by Republicans and Democrats over the last 30 years.
Oh, I agree fully. Bush was a big spender. Matter of fact, he increased spending faster than Obama's increased spending. So I put more of the blame on him.
You're blaming both parties, right, for the fiscal situation?
I blame politicians, regardless of their party, if they vote to increase the burden of spending and create more of a dependency and entitlement mindset in America. And so I worry we are becoming European, not just in terms of our fiscal policy, but also in terms of the culture of the American people.
Stan, isn't that true? I mean, talking about, all of the benefits in terms of having benefits for life, that is very European, if you will.
Yeah, and people are living longer, and they're as a result, Medicare and Social Security expenses are way beyond what had initially been projected, or even projected relatively recently. The fact that people are living longer, though, is not something we should be upset about. But I just want to disagree with something pretty fundamentally. We either have a spending problem because we're not willing to raise taxes to pay for them, to pay for commitments we've made, or we have a revenue problem because we're not, we're spending more than we're willing to tax. They're really two sides of the same coin, and you can't just say it's a spending issue.
Well, you can say it's a spending issue, though, if we are repeating the exact same mistakes they made in Europe. And in Europe, for the last 30 years, they keep raising taxes, but the politicians spend the money, then they raise taxes again. It's like a game of leapfrog, but the tax frog never catches up to the spending frog, and sooner or later the taxes kill the private economy, and that's exactly what we're seeing in Europe, because austerity in most of Europe simply means raise taxes to try to protect the so-called public sector.
Yeah, go ahead, Stan.
No, I was going to say, Dan, you raised the magic word, austerity. I can't believe that you would want to cut spending in the midst of this current slow economic recovery. I agree, there's definitely a long-term issue. But the idea that, and I thought this was what Gerstner was saying with his clip there, that we would be allowing all of these spending cuts and tax increases to go into effect in January when the economy can't handle it. That is, austerity would be maybe the worst way to deal with this issue on a short-term basis.
Yeah, I mean, what about that? Do you really want to put all that austerity in now? I mean, take away so many programs just at a time when things are so fragile and the recovery is just gaining traction?
I want to impose public sector austerity like the Baltic countries, like Estonia have done. Estonia is growing 7.6% a year because they've cut government spending. I don't want private sector austerity, which is what's happening in France and Italy and Spain and Greece. That simply means higher taxes. So it's critical to define austerity correctly, i.e. squeezing the government budget so that we can leave more resources in the productive sector of the economy.
Well, that would be fine if there wasn't, if the private sector wasn't hoarding as much cash as it is. It's sitting on more cash than at any time in U.S. history.
Yep.
State and local governments are cutting back.
But that's because government is threatening the private economy.
Right. Gentlemen, thank you so much. You've both brought up terrific points. We'll keep following that and have you back soon.